So it's the next morning, and I'm still waiting to hear from Tone King. They're on the West Coast, so they won't even be getting into the office for about another hour as I film this part. I did some looking around last night inside the amp, and I spoke to the owner this morning. And as far as the impedance thing, where it had a 16 ohm speaker, it was set to 8 ohms. He was using an aux box, and that might contribute to the issues here. We'll find out more about that. Nothing against the aux box per se, but if there was a problem in the amp, even a fairly good load like that can be problematic. I'm waiting to hear specifically about this disconnected wire and all three of these apparently not being in the right place. This amp was purchased new by the owner. It has never been gone into before, so everything here, including the Coinbase 5881s, more on those shortly, everything here is factory, including this. Some notes about this amp in general. Well, first of all, let's start with what probably happened. So you have these Coinbase fake 5881s. They're really 606 GCs, just called 5881s by Softec, with the metal bear trap retainers pressing into the glass, like I said. That could stress either of these tubes. And any stress that the tube would have might be exaggerated by being run into a load box, though I don't know that's the case. I don't know of the sequence of events, whether a tube shorted, causing the cathode bias resistors, which is what these two 10 watts are, to run way the hell too hot. And once that happened, they roasted this 105 degree, very high quality capacitor, causing it to explode. And when this capacitor exploded, it shorted, which meant that at that point, there was no bias on the amp. The cathode was at ground. The grid was referenced to ground. I think these poor tubes probably had a meltdown. That would not have contributed to this. But I don't trust those tubes. So those tubes are going away. We're going to get some TAD 606 GCs with a plastic base. So I don't know whether the tube took out these or these took out the tube, but I'm pretty sure that the heat from these killed this. And each one of these measures about 640, 650 ohms. I don't know whether these were originally 620 ohm resistors or 680 ohm resistors or something else entirely, which they could have changed their actual value based on the amount of heat present, enough heat to shatter that ceramic. So I'm hoping that I can get that information from BAD, Boutique Audio Distribution. The real thing I need from them, though, is this, because this is a pair of 6L6s cathode bias with two 10-watt resistors in parallel with each other. So I could order some 680s, some 1Ks, some 820s, find where it needs to be, and just kind of tack solder them in place temporarily until I find where I like the bias for this. I'm not too fussed about what the factory bias was, because so many factories get things like that wrong. And that sounds real opinionated and big-headed, but it's just reality. There are a lot of people making apps who don't read data sheets. Now, that said, I may experiment and say that, 620 or 680 was just perfect and they did it great. And if so, I'll report back. But that's easily done. Now, here you can see where the two 10 watts were and where that capacitor was. We're going to get to why this looks ugly right here in just a minute. So first of all, this resistor gets really hot. Obviously got really hot enough to crack itself. But even before it gets that nuclear hot, it gets way too hot for a capacitor to be mounted here. This is one problem with this amp. So I'm probably going to relocate that capacitor. It's a 100 volt, 22 microfarad, pretty standard stuff. And this is just the cathode. So it runs from pin 8 of each 6L6 to ground. So I could physically put in an axial cap mounted over here and get some space away from these hot things. If I were laying out this amp, I would have had that capacitor mounted maybe over here just to have about an inch or so space between the capacitor body and the resistor. This one's probably enough distance right here. So, Tone King, if you see this, consider moving that capacitor. And when you do, now we're going to get to why this negative one looks so fugly. This entire area of the board has a big ground plane on it, and there's perforations in the board here to allow cooling for these 10 watts mounted up against the board. And this ground and this ground and this ground all have what are called thermal connections to that ground plane. They're thermal pads. And that is if this is the eyelet, if this is the hole and this is the pad, I'm doing it here because it's larger, there would be a gap in the ground plane around that, and there would be a crisscross, like one from the ground plane to this pad here, one here, one here, one here. It looks like a crosshair. And that was almost okay for these two ground connections, though these are very small pads. If you look at the pads for this resistor here or this resistor here, those are physically larger in relation to the component lead. These are much smaller. You can see the same thing here. And when you have a very small pad that has a thermal pad, then by the time you heat this up at all, the surrounding heat sink begins to draw off the heat from the soldering iron. It's very hard to do this kind of work on these. And this pad was even smaller, and it just kept pumping heat into it. I could not heat the pad up without heating the entire area of the board up enough, so this never wanted to become desoldered. Notice how clean the positive is. It's the same size hole, but this did not have a thermal connection. So if you want to do thermal pads, that's okay. You need to make your pads a little bit physically larger, just so the pad, the center of the pad will get hot before the heat radiates out to the ground plane. Better yet, don't have your pads on a tube amp like this, through hole, done to thermal pads. Have this go to a ground, which runs like, a quarter of an inch, and then into a ground plane. So if this is the ground plane and just one thin trace for ground, not too thin, but thin enough to a fairly large size pad, then you can do this kind of work better. So this, I'm going to put little dabs of pretty solder on, but I'm going to physically mount the new capacitor, probably from pin 8 right here to this ground here. Just get that space. Another note on this, when you design PCBs, there are pre-made components in your library typically. Or even if you alter one to customize it, there will be, hey, this pad is, the pad itself has this outer diameter and this inner diameter. And if you just choose it from the library and say, yeah, that'll fit, that's great, you can end up with problems like this. What you should do at that point is say, all right, well, that's where it will fit. And say that opening is 0.8 millimeters and it has a 1.2 millimeter pad. Go ahead and increase the size of the pad. And maybe even give yourself a little more inner diameter for the lead for heat issues. Because this, I'm good at what I do, and I have all the proper tools, and this was pretty dodgy, and even these weren't great. And if you have a larger pad with better consideration of the thermal nature of working on it, things get better. This was all done, all the components placed, and then it was gone through a solder wave station, and everything was flowed. And you can do that once pretty easily. But reworking it, doing service, becomes problematic with the PCB with just the default component dimensions like that. I know that sounds real nitpicky, but this is the stuff that matters, because this would have been a much simpler repair had I not run into these issues like this. and where you place the components. All right, C41 is the cathode bypass cap for R53 and R54. Well, here's the positive, all in a row, and the negative, and the negative, and the negative. We'll just have all these on the same ground plane. Done, right? That's what the textbook says. Experience says, hey, that cap will absolutely get baked if it's that close to that hot resistor. Move it over here, etc., etc. So if it seems like I'm being harsh on this amp, that's just physics being harsh. This is a very expensive amp, and overall, it's built very well, but it's easy to do things like this with all these 1-watt metal oxides or these Mallory 150Ms. There's no real heat for these, and everything there is fine, and what seems to be a default component from the library works okay. When you get into this stuff, you need to be smarter than your software program. Now, on that note, this capacitor and this capacitor are too close to this 10-watt resistor. This one might be a little too close to this 5-watt, depending on how hot that gets. I won't know until it powers on. Much of this was done just fine, but things like this could be problematic in the future, just as the cathode stuff is. Now, I considered using chassis-mounted aluminum-clad resistors, 25 or 50 watt, for the output cathode instead of the two 10 watts in parallel on the board as it came in. And that would be my preference. Couple of strikes against that. Number one, unless I can get the schematic, and I agree with the schematic, I don't know what value resistor to use. It's much cheaper to experiment with a little 75-cent 10 watts than to order a bunch of $8 or more 25 or 50 watts. I prefer to use the 50 watt. So that's a pragmatic reason. The other issue is that these are already here. These are all in the attenuation circuit. These are 50 watts. If I were to add a chassis clad here just for the output, then I'd have the output signal, even in just a cathode form, real close to the input. I don't think that's a good idea. The other end of the amp, there are big bundles of power wire going to the power transformer, and I don't want to put a resistor that could potentially get very hot there. It'd burn through those wires, and there's really no other place in the amp to do it, even on the bottom, because the PCB takes up pretty much all the space inside the amp. Where there isn't PCB, there is a transformer. So that's not really an option for the cathode bias stuff, though I would prefer it, and I think Tone King should consider it going forward. If you're using 3 of them for your attenuation, might as well find a place in the chassis to have a 4th one. And if they were to redo this board and just cut an opening in the board here where these are. So if this just had an opening in the board, you could have a chassis mount right there, I believe. Yeah, there's nothing, no, there's a tube socket, but in this area. Just a thought. That would make it better. So I'm waiting to hear back from Tone King about the connections from the output transformer to those quick connects, P1, P2, P3. And that's part of their ultralinear operation. So if those are messed up for whatever reason, that could be what caused the downfall here. I will know more soon. All right, I spoke to a real nice guy who represents Sky King, and they sent me the schematic. So I know that those two 10-watt resistors for the cathode originally were 500 ohm, even though they measure closer to 640 now. So I know what to order there. I'm going to get some 500s and some 620s and 680s and just play around and find the exact right spot it should be. And like I said, I'm going to put the new bypass cap in a different location so it won't be a subject to heat. But as far as this mystery, previous Sky Kings had a choice of 4 ohms or 8 ohms. This one has 8 or 16. And this red and yellow is the 16 ohm. This yellow here is the 8, and this white is the 4. This amp does not use the 4 ohm tap. It's just right here. I think I'm going to put a zip tie just so it can't touch anything it should not. But on On previous ones, they would have had the red one disconnected, even though it would nominally be here and there is a relay for that. They changed their mind at some point because the schematic shows this red and yellow not actually connected to this part of the circuit. But anyway, the old ones would have had the red and yellow floating, the yellow here, and the white here. So you have a choice of 8 ohms or 4 ohms. On this one, you have a choice of 16 ohms or 8 ohms. And so there's the mystery. And I'm just going to grab a zip tie real quick and put this right here so it can't touch anything it should not. And that should be good. Well, we're going to have a very happy ending on this one. I already had some 500 ohm 10 watt Zycons. I've installed them just the way they were originally, but mounted a little bit farther off the board. And this amp's been on about 30 minutes, and they're just slightly warm to the touch. This is with a test pair of 6L6s, and the bias is set a little on the cool side, about 75%, but the wall voltage is a little low today. I'll recheck that with the Variac set to 120, but not cold by any means. And this is a Tim bypass cap. This is a 47 microfarad 100 volt. The original was a 27 microfarad 100 volt. And I wanted to know what my options were. 27's an odd value. And I've got to get a pair of 6L6s for this amp. And I wanted to hopefully get whatever I needed to get for this amp from the same vendor so the owner didn't pay extra shipping charges to a bunch of different vendors. There's only about 33 volts across this cap. So I could get a 100 volt cap. I could get a 63 volt cap. I could probably do a 50 volt cap, but a 63 volt cap or 100 volt cap is fine. 22, 33, even this 47 would be fine. You're not going to hear a huge difference. Let's see what it's sounding like on the rhythm channel. So that's all good. Now there's some buzz right now. This is not all the way attached. That seems excessive though. Where's that buzz coming from? It's not, the guitar volume's off. So it may be some lead dress. That's affecting a little bit. Could be a tube. I have the reverb off. That's not reverb noise we're hearing. We're not getting any reverb noise with it off either. I wonder what's going on with that. So I'll revisit that in a little bit. Let's try the lead. Same noise. That's all very promising, but that buzz has got to go. I'll revisit all that when the new 6L6s arrive. Actually, I need to revisit it. I need to check it now before they arrive, just in case, so I can order a tube if necessary. So let me go through that process. That's going to be fun. And let's make sure the attenuation is working. So we're... So negative 36 dB, negative 24, 18, 9, 3, none. That's good, and we'll check on the rhythm as well. So just got to track down that buzz that's present on both channels. Making real good progress, so. And ultralinear. So that's all good. Let me see where that buzz is coming from. Well, good. All that buzz was just because this black anodized panel was not screwed down to the full chassis. I thought that just pressing it up would be fine, that they'd contact each other enough. Apparently that was incorrect, but now that that's been just 2 screws attached, so nothing wrong with any of the preamp stuff at all. In fact, the amp sounds really nice. Once the new tubes arrive, we'll do a real playing test of this one so you can all get a sense for yourself how it does. The other notes I have on this amp as far as overall impressions, I covered the 2 small component pads and the insufficient heat management when it came to thermal coupling to the ground planes, etc. The other main thing is if you're going to use PCB-mounted tube sockets, and I can see why some people need to meet a price point, whatever, though this is certainly not a budget amp, that's especially where you need to use much larger pads. Let me show that. These 6L6s and the GZ34 over there, these pads are just really tiny. They need to be much heftier, much heavier weight, because odds are at some point someone will need to change that socket in the potential life span of the amp. And those little bitty ones just don't hold up to repeated soldering and desoldering. It's not like you're going to be doing it every year, every 5 years, but that's a major pain. Much better if there was a healthier amount of pad there. Even just the mechanical stress of the tube, though they have screws on either side, which really do help. So the screws attached to the chassis and the board, not just the board. And the board doesn't have much flex at all in this area. So, I'm not looking to find fault, but those solder pads are really on the teeny tiny side for an output tube socket. Anyway, enough doom and gloom. Once the new tubes arrive, this thing should sound fantastic. So happy thoughts, everyone. Happy thoughts.